All right, today, let me tell you something about myself that you may or may not know. Most of you probably already do, but I'm just going to throw this out there anyway. There's going to be a lot of disclaimers today. I feel compelled to give them. I can be very annoying. It's just a fact of it. I don't mind kind of prodding a little bit. I don't mind arguing a little bit. I try to call it heated discussion, but I don't have any problem with that. I enjoy it. I like the debate. I like the back and forth. I'm a questioner. I'm the kind of person who typically, I don't know, whatever you say, I'm immediately going to think the opposite, you know. It's just where we go. I'm going to say it's the way God made me and blame it on him. But no, I like to do that. You say something's blue, I'm probably going to say, well, it might be a little red. You know, it's just the way that I am. And the Lord's really been dealing with me on that, saying, hey, listen, you need to be a little slower to speak, right? A little quicker to listen, right? It's one of the things he's been hitting me with a little bit. So when I have opportunities to do what I'm going to be doing today and over the next 3 weeks, I'm like, yes, because I get to use my gifts, right? Because I'm going to push a little bit, right? Today and over the next at least 2 weeks, maybe longer than that, I'm going to push a little bit. Maybe even a lot, right? And I'll be honest, I hope it gets a reaction. I do. If you do not react to the things that I'm saying over the next 3 weeks, I believe it's either because you're just not listening, or you are so arrogant as to believe that I'm not talking to you. Okay? I prayed this morning, and I've tried to say over the last couple of days several times, my goal is to constantly say us and we. Because what I want you to understand is I'm in the middle of this too. So when I start to rant, which I'm going to do at different points, please understand that I am ranting to myself as much as I am to you. Okay, we talked about this last night at the men's group. I don't want you to think for a second that I've got a great handle on all of the things we're going to talk about. And if you don't believe me, just talk to my wife and she'll confirm the fact that I don't. Okay? So please just kind of keep those things in mind. All right? So what we're going to be talking about, if you weren't here last week and I kind of threw it out there, or if you haven't seen me in the last couple of weeks, we're going to be talking about manhood and womanhood. What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? Last night, Sonny kicked off this whole discussion. We had our men's get together, the first of what I think is going to be many men's gatherings and sort of men's weekends. He kicked it off, something the Lord had really been laying on his heart. You got to do this with men. You got to answer this question of where's the godly man? And the Lord had been dealing with me for a long time about just manhood and womanhood in general, so it was a great kickoff. So that's what we're going to be talking about. I think it's a discussion that is so needed in our society today, because I think there's such a confusion on what does it mean to be a man. What does it mean to be a woman? In the course of our conversations, I do want to be very sensitive to some things. We may talk about some things that some of us may get very excited about and not think about other people are really struggling with it. And that's kind of vague. It'll become clearer as we go through this. But for example, I don't say this to be funny. I don't say this to get a rise out of people and be like, yeah, that's not why I'm going to say what I'm about to say. But I think there is such confusion when it comes to manhood and womanhood, and you don't have to look very far to see it. I read 2 different articles this week, and I'm not a Facebook person. All right, so somebody can correct me and say you're way off here, or the people that I'm going to get ready to quote are way off. But I read 2 different articles. One of them said that there are over 50 gender identifiers on Facebook. Another article said there were over 70 gender identifiers on Facebook. If that doesn't speak to a confusion about who we are as men and women, I don't know what does. Okay? And we all are aware of the debates and the issues that have been going on with bathrooms and gender-specific bathrooms and those kinds of things. So this is a big topic. Okay? So what I would like to do is this morning, I want to kind of lay a foundation for where we're going to go in the next couple of weeks. My plan is for next week to talk about men. All right, men, so men don't skip out on me. And then the following week to talk about women. All right? And If we don't hear what I have to say this morning, if we don't hear what God has to say this morning, the next 2 weeks are going to be impossible. Okay? They're going to cause hard feelings and division and all kinds of other things. So we have got to hear what God says for us this morning. All right? And there's two things. We'll go ahead and we'll throw it out on the table now. There's two things that I want to make sure we leave here with today that we've got to hear. And that's this. The first one is that God determines our purpose. God determines who we are. God and God alone. All right? That's one. And the second thing is we need to leave here understanding that we are all created in the image of God. Okay? So those two things. We're going to talk about both of them. All right, so let's jump right in. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 is where we're going to start. And we are going to move around a little bit. So if you may not want to turn there, we won't be there really long. But it says this: in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We've all heard that familiar passage of Scripture. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But this one statement is so unbelievably powerful. It is so full of information and implications and all of these other things that impact the way that we see ourselves, the way that we see the world, the way that we see God, all of these other things. Okay, so I want to begin by focusing on a couple things in this passage. First, in the beginning, there was God and nothing else. And that's a hard concept for us to wrap our head around because we think temporally, we think about time, we think, okay, well, where did God come from? This passage tells us that God came from nowhere. He's always been. He has always existed. Before there was anything else, there was God. Okay, before there was anything material, before there was even time, there was God. Okay? The best we can, we got to wrap our heads around there. In the beginning was God. And it says, and in the beginning, God created. Created. That word created is just a powerful word. It means to shape, to fashion. Okay, there is intent in this word. So right away, we're not talking about accident. Okay, we're not talking about an accident. We're not talking about something random. In the beginning, something happened. That's not what it says. Okay, it says in the beginning, God created. God was intentional. God fashioned, God formed everything that we see, the heavens and the earth. All right? So in this, we have intention, we have design, we have purpose. God is creating purposefully. Okay? Now, why is that so important? As we begin to go through the rest of the chapter, which we won't read this morning, but you begin to see God making everything. He makes the heavens and the earth, and he begins to set things in motion. He begins to put the stars in the sky, the sun in the sky, the moon in the sky. He begins to set the times of when they will rise and when they will set, where they will rise and where they will set. He will put the oceans on the earth and set the limits. He'll tell them where to start and where to end. He will put plants and trees and all of these things onto the earth, and we see that he puts them in a place in a way for them to reproduce with seeds. I mean, have you ever thought about that? Just the beautiful design of how plants reproduce. I mean, it's crazy. You look at it and you start to think, maybe this is by design, right? Then he puts the animals in place, and he creates every living thing, all the birds in the sky and all the animals in the seas and all the other animals. We see the cattle and the livestock and all of these things, and he creates them in a way for them to reproduce, and he gives them a purpose, a way to survive, a way to eat and to live. All of these things God puts in place, and then he creates man, right? And he gives man a job, and we're going to read that in a little bit. You can see design, right? You see purpose. You see intention in the way God did these things, okay? So then, this will be my first big question of the day. So if we see design around us, if we see intention around us, that tells us, that suggests, even without the Bible, that suggests creation, right? We're going to read a passage in a minute that talks about all you got to do is look around, and you will see design. It smacks of a creator. All right, so if there is a creator who has designed and created everything, who is it that has the right to say what purpose is all about? The creator, right? The person who creates something gets to say what the intention was, what the purpose is. Now, if this is that's kind of we get that. Do we? Do we get that? Because here's the implication that is clear in this. If God is the creator and he creates us, then do we get to say what our purpose is? No. Here's the implication. You're not God. I'm not God. We don't get to say this is how things should run. This is our purpose. This is why we were created. We don't get to say that. Right? The scriptures become really clear, and it's Jeremiah 18, 3 through 6. Jeremiah says, "So I went down to the potter's house, and I saw him working at the wheel. But the pot he was shaping from the clay was marred in his hands. So the potter formed it into another pot, shaping it as he seemed as best to him." Right, now that's huge. We can't even get into all the implications. We're going to talk about marring in a second, the marring of image. But he says, so the potter formed it into another pot, shaping it as seemed best to him. Then the word of the Lord came to me. He said, "Can I not do with you, Israel, as this potter does?" Now, every time you see the word Israel, you can think the people of God. Okay, the people of God. That's what it's referring to. So God says, "Can I not do with my people as this potter does? Like clay in the hand of the potter, so are you in my hand, Israel." Okay, so the Creator decides the purpose, just as the potter decides the purpose of the pot. Romans 9, 20 and 21. "But who are you, a human being, to talk back to God?" All right, now listen, this will start to get a little bit personal. Throughout this series, my hope is that you will be very introspective, that I will be very introspective in this, that as we hear these words, we will begin to allow God to run a filter over us to show us what is true about the way that we live, the way that we think, the way that we feel, all of these things. Okay, so I hope as we begin to read this, you start to ask, God, where am I in all of this? But who are you, a human being, to talk back to God? You ever talk back to God? "Shall what is formed say to the one who formed it, 'Why did you make me like this?'" Everybody ask those questions? Lord, why did you make me like this? Why did you put me in this situation? "Does not the potter have the right to make out of the same lump of clay, some pottery for special purposes and some for common use?" Isaiah 45:9. "Woe to those who quarrel with their maker, those who are nothing but potsherds," that's pottery, "among the potsherds on the ground. Does the clay say to the potter, 'What are you making?' Does your work say, 'The potter has no hands'?" There's a lot of different interpretations of that last part, but basically what it's saying is, does the pot have the right to look and say, and question the design? Okay? Do we have a right to question the design of God? It seems like such an easy answer, doesn't it? But do we live like that? Do we live like that, or do we determine for ourselves what our purpose is? I would argue that we do the latter, that we look and we make ourselves God. Okay, that we make ourselves the designer, the person who gets to say what the intent was, what our purpose is. And this is the age that we live in, right? This postmodern, existential, this is what life is all about. You decide, you get to pick, you pick your own destiny. This is the world we live in, right? I was coaching basketball a couple of years ago, and I'm talking to this girl that was just really upset, one of the players, right? And she didn't play on our team, she played on another team. But, I'm talking to her, and she's all ticked off and all upset and everything, and I'm like, "What's going on?" She says, "Man, I can't stand him," talking about one of the coaches. "I can't stand him." I said, "Why?" I said, "Because he thinks he can tell me what to do." I said, "He's the coach. That's what he's supposed to do." Right? But isn't that the world we live in? Honestly, who can tell you what to do? Everywhere you look. That's what we're saying. My parents aren't going to tell me what to do. I'm my own person. Right? We tell our boss. My boss ain't going to tell me what to do. The police aren't going to tell me what to do. Right? Every position of authority we look at and say, "You're not going to tell me what to do." And I would contend that we do the same thing with God. We look at God and say, "God, you're not going to tell me what to do. I'm going to do what I want." Right? And when we do this, things go badly. Okay? I'm going to rant about that in a second. Genesis 3. Start with verse 1. It says, "Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, 'Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?'" Okay, so listen, Adam and Eve have already been created. Man and woman have been created. God has created them with a purpose. He's been intentional. He's got a design. He's got a point behind it, and he has put them within the context of creation to fill a certain role. Okay? And Satan's going to come along. He's going to try to get them to question that. Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? The woman said to the serpent, we may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it or you will die. And we're going to talk about some of the implications of how this transaction went down in the next couple of weeks. But Satan replies, you will not certainly die. What is Satan doing here? He is undermining the plan of God. He is undermining the authority of God. God is not telling you the truth. He is lying to you. That is not what is going to happen. It says the serpent said to the woman, for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened and you will be, what's it say? Like God, knowing good and evil. When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. All right, so what has just happened here? We had this creation, right? God has created everything. Gets to a point where he says, man, this is very good. Everything is functioning as it is supposed to function. And then Satan comes along and does what? He begins to undermine, again, the authority and the plan of God. Right? He comes and says, that plan's no good for you. That plan's no good for you. That's not going to suit you. That's not going to make you happy. You know, you're created for more than that. There's something different out there for you. Okay, listen, these are the same whispers that the enemy is going to come to us with. God's plan for you, that's not his plan. That's not even a good plan. That's not going to make you happy. That's not going to make you fulfilled. This is what you need to do. And what does Eve do? She listens. She listens. She begins to say, maybe God's plan isn't the best thing for me. And she begins to undermine that plan, to go against the purpose of God, to go against the design of God. And we know what happens, right? We have the fall. Sin has entered into the world. Sin begins to mar. We're going to talk about this in a second. The image of God, the creation and design of God. It begins to disrupt what God has put into place. This beautiful, perfect design. Satan has now thrown a monkey wrench in, right? We have got to be aware of this in our lives. We have got to be aware of that constant whisper to go against the plan of God, the design of God, to not allow God to be God, to take his place. You hear that? You will be like God. Hear the attempt to try to usurp God's authority and to take that place? Listen, you are not God. You're a pot. I'm a pot. We don't get to tell the potter what the design is. Okay? When we begin to live our lives in this way where we take our own authority, where we start to say, I know what's best for me, I know what would make me happy, we are a pot telling the potter how we should have been made. Okay? So it goes back to the question, do you believe that first sentence of the Bible, in the beginning God created? Do you believe that? Because if you don't, you're going to struggle with the next 2 weeks. As we begin to talk about how God has created us as men and women, there's going to be this pushback. There's going to be this stepping up and saying, I don't believe that's true. I make this comment all the time, and I hope it comes across the way that it plays out in my mind. When people begin, well, I just don't think, who cares what you think? Like, that sounds harsh. Is the potter listening to the pot? Okay, and don't hear what I'm not saying. Does God hear us? Absolutely. And so I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about when it comes to purpose and design. God knows what's best, and he has designed us that way. Okay? We don't go against that. When we begin to go against that design, we begin to take it in our hands and say, I know better than God. Okay? So when we begin to talk about some of these things and it rubs us the wrong way, which it's going to. Listen, let's be honest about this. Men, I'm going to ask you, God's going to ask you and push you farther than you want to go. Okay, that's the reality. He is going to push you farther than you want to go. Ladies, he is going to have a role for you that may grate on you, that you may not like. In those moments, I want to encourage you. I want to encourage myself to resist the temptation to try to be God. To say, I know what's best. Do you believe that in the beginning God created? That He has ultimate authority when it comes to design, intent, and purpose for our lives? Do we believe that? And that's, again, it sounds so simple until you actually start to try to put that into practice. Because then all of a sudden you go, you know what, maybe this just doesn't feel right. Maybe this just doesn't, I don't really agree with this. I don't really like this. I'm not really comfortable with this. Proverbs 14:12 says there's a way that appears to be right. King James would say there's a way that appeareth right to a man. But in the end, it leads to what? Death. There is a way that's going to seem right. Right? Satan didn't come saying something crazy and off the wall. You notice he used some truth in that? He tried to appeal to some logic in this. Okay, there's a way that's going to seem right. And a lot of the things that we talk about now, when you hear people start talking about the roles of men and women, you're going to go, you know what, maybe that is right. And I think that's why we've caved. Right? There's some things that we hear over time. We go, you know what? Maybe that is the right perspective. Maybe that is the right thing. Maybe we need to adopt that point of view. So we have conceded many of the things that God has designed. Okay? There's a way that appears right, but in the end it leads to death. Listen to Philippians 3:19. It says their destiny, talking about all of us that have gone against God, that have decided that we're going to be God of our own lives, that we're going to be the Lord of our lives, we're going to determine our purpose. Their destiny is destruction. Their God is their stomach. What does that mean? Their God is their desires, their appetites, the things that they want, and their glory is in their shame. It says their mind is set on earthly things. What did Satan do? He pulled what was good to look at, what was good to taste. And he said, man, look at this. He took our eyes off of God and put it on that. He put it on earthly things. Okay, we need to be aware of that constantly because there is a danger in this. Destruction, it says. Their destiny is destruction. In the end, it leads to death. Can you hear the seriousness in this? All right, now look, Romans chapter 1. We're going to spend camp out here just for a couple of minutes. 18 through 32. We're going to see the result of what happens when as men and women, we go against the design of God. When we decide I'm going to go my own way, I'm going to do my own thing. I'm going to be the God of my life. I'm going to go according to my desires, what seems right to me. This is what happens. Verse 18 says, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people. That word godlessness, I love in this context, means refusing to give honor where honor is due. When we lose sight of the fact that in the beginning God created, when we lose sight of that and all of a sudden we take the place of God, godlessness and wickedness begins to set in. It says, who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. What does that mean? That means that God is evident and visible if we're willing to open our eyes and look. In the beginning, God created is something that should come easily to us if we're willing to open our eyes and look around, because God has made it clear. When you begin to look around at the way the world operates, you will see that there is a rhythm to it, right? There is a consistency to it, right? The sun comes up in the same place every day, right? It's not random. It just doesn't happen. Every single day it's the same. When you stand in a high place and you step off, guess which direction you go? Down every time. And the older you get, the harder you go down. But you go down every time. There's an order to it. There's a consistency to it. If you begin to look at all the things that are necessary for life to take place, it's actually a little scary. Right? It's actually a little scary to know that if one little thing was different, we wouldn't live. We wouldn't exist. Right? If the earth just changed and tilted just one little degree, we fail to live. If we get off the axis just a little bit from going around the sun, we fail to exist. If the oxygen in the air changes, we fail to exist. All of these different things that are so necessary for life, and yet all the dials are perfectly where they need to be. Doesn't that begin to suggest that maybe this is by design? Right? If you just look around, stop and look around, you see the glory of God, right? He says the things that aren't seen, we can look at in ourselves. In ourselves, we should know there's a God, right? Common sense will tell us that it can't just be biology, right? It's not just cells and all these kinds of things that are going on, right? How would you explain love? How would you explain beauty? How do you explain truth? If all there is just biology and we just developed from whatever and this developed into this or whatever, and it's all just physicality, it's all just biology, it's just what you see, there's no spirit, there's no any of that kind of stuff. How do you explain things like that? How do you explain love and beauty and truth? How do you explain those things without, it points to a God, right? Why is it that there are certain things that are universally condemned? Right? Is there any culture that's going, rape is great? We should be doing that. No, it's universally condemned, right? There are things that we look at and we just know are wrong. Where does that come from? Doesn't that suggest a God? Where do we get this morality from? This idea of right and wrong. Where does that even come from? Like, do you think there's a lion out there that's getting ready to go kill a zebra and he's going, is this the right thing to do? Not really sure. No, he doesn't wrestle with that. We wrestle with that, right? Why? Because there's a God who has put something in us. And we're going to talk about that more in just 1 second. Right? Looking around at creation, it screams that there is a God. This is by design. This is not accident. This is not happenstance. There is a design to what we see around us. It points and screams that there is a God, so people are without excuse. Right? To not believe in God, and I firmly believe this, it's a willful thing where you have to make a decision, I'm not going to believe in God, and you have to ignore some things. You have to ignore in the beginning God created. Okay? And one of the big reasons why I think we ignore it is because we want to be God. We want to be God. We want to be the point. Right? Anybody want your life to be all about you? I'm not going to lie, I like it a lot. I like when it's about me. I'm not going to lie to you, right? So I think in people who say, I'm looking at this in an unbiased way, are you really? Are you really? Or are you really just trying to look for a reason to do whatever you want to do? Okay? We look around and all creation just shouts that there is a God. He says, for although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. I like that. Their thinking became in vain. It became useless. Have you noticed the more enlightened we get, the farther away we get from God? And I forgot this. The more enlightened we get, the more educated we get, we've entered into madness now, haven't we? And that's exactly what this says. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being, and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. We serve created things rather than the Creator. I've contended this several times. You are going to serve something. You're going to serve something. The question is what? What is it that you serve? What is it that is Lord of your life? What is it that you're living for? And what this passage says is, as we get farther and farther and farther away from God, the less clearly we see things, right? The more that we begin to put our faith and our trust in these created things, the crazier the world gets. Is anybody going to argue this? Right? Is anyone going to argue this? I've made this point several times this week, and I've done it poorly, and I pray that it comes out better this time. I love the fact that you could take this passage of Scripture that was written 2,000 years ago, and it could have been written today. Right? As we begin, especially listen to where we're going to go in this. Paul is going to lay out what happens when we start to do this, when we start to worship created things rather than the Creator. When we start worshiping ourselves, a created thing. When we start worshiping money, something that's created. When we start worshiping any other thing other than God has been created. He's the only thing that wasn't created, right? The only being that wasn't created. When we start worshiping anything else but God, life goes in a certain direction. Are we going to argue that? Are we going to look around and say that the world is not depraved and has lost its mind? Right? See, here's the thing. Okay, here comes the rant. We live in a progressive society, right? That's the way we would deem it. We live in a progressive society. What does the word progressive mean? It means to progress, to rise to a higher level is what that word means. Somebody tell me where we progressed. Somebody give me something. Where have we progressed? Have our societies progressed as a whole? Is there not still as much killing, as many genocidal maniacs in the world? Are people still being oppressed all over the world and slaughtered? Is that still not happening in our civilized society, our civilized world? Let's get a little more specific. Has the families progressed? Has the family units gotten stronger? Marriages gotten stronger? How about financially? We in a better financial place now and as a country and the world, any of those kinds of things than we used to be? Tell me where we have progressed. There is no way that you can look at our society now and not look at it and say it's crazy. It's a mess. You have got to close your eyes, right, in order to not see it. In order to not see it. But people will do that, right? As we begin to talk about the design of God, people will say, well, that's archaic, that's old stuff. Nobody lives. We've progressed since then, really? Where have we progressed? I don't see it. Now listen to it. Listen to this description. He says, because of this. Because of what? Because of man's turning to created things rather than the Creator. From man deciding, this is the way I was designed, this is my purpose, I'm going to live out my life the way that I want to, I'm going to be God now, I'm going to take God's place, and I'm going to decide all of these things. I know what life is all about, and I'm going to live that way. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty of their error. Now listen, churches love that, right? Why? Because who are we focused on? Homosexuals, right? Oh man, see that God hates homosexuals. Our society has gone downhill, homosexuals everywhere, right? Okay, well let's keep reading. Let's keep reading in this. Does God say that's a result of it, that there's going to be this confusion in identity, that men and women are going to lose sight of who they are, and it's going to show up in sexuality? Absolutely, he says that, but let's keep reading. Verse 28, furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind, so that they do what ought not to be done. Now listen, I love that. The King James says it this way, that God gives us over to the imagination of our heart. At some point, when we begin to turn away from God, we want to be our own God. God says, have at it. Have at it. Do your thing. Where does it go? Right in this place. Okay? I believe that's where we are as a country. I believe God has said, okay, go ahead. Anybody under the delusion that we're still a Christian nation? Right? I mean, seriously, come on. Are we really? We claim to be. Man, you look at the numbers and you'll see so many people still believe in God, still believe in Jesus, still would affirm that in the beginning God created. Right? They'll say all those things, but our morals, our values, all of these things indicate that is simply not true. Verse 29, they have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed. And this is what I want us to do as we're reading this list. Again, we read a couple verses before that where it was real easy to point the finger and say, homosexuals. Do you see yourself in this? Do you see yourself in this? I would challenge you to listen to the way he's describing these things. In the list that he gives, do you find yourself in this? Filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed. What is greed? The desire for more things. Anybody here willing to say that's me? You don't have to raise your hand unless you want. Anybody here willing to say, man, that's me. I'm consumed with more stuff. Bigger, better, faster, shinier. That's me. I got to have all that stuff. That's greed. That's greed. When we begin to make ourselves the point, not God, greed sets in. We become consumed by stuff. He says in depravity, they are full of envy. Anybody here full of envy? We look up that definition. It means enjoying others' misfortune. I love that. We should get that reaction with a lot of the Come on, man. We love to see people that got it coming to them, right? That's what envy means. We think of envy as I really want what they have, and there's a component of that. But envy, to take joy in someone else's suffering. Is that you? Would you be honest and say, yes, man, I enjoy to see some people stumble and fall. There's some people that I really like to see get what they deserve. It's envy, murder, strife. Anybody like to argue, quarrel? Anybody here hard to get along with? Of course, no one would say that about yourself. Anybody here sitting next, don't point at them or look at them. Anybody here know somebody, just say, man, they're difficult to get along with. They are so hard to get along with. They're just constantly contentious and argumentative. All right, strife. Deceit. Got any liars in here? Just proved it. Murder, strife, deceit, malice. They are, how many people when you get on rides, like on roller coasters and things like that, hold your breath? You ever do that? Because you get that feeling in your stomach, that really nauseous, upset. You're just like, ugh. How many people when you get up to the top of that, you're just like, hold your breath. There's times that I want to make sure that I give you, hold your breath. This is one of those times. Listen to this next word. They are gossips. Gossips. Now, not many people put themselves in this category, right? I would imagine if I said, how many gossipers do we have in here? I'm not going to see a ton of hands go up, right? Just a couple honest people. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that I believe almost all of us should raise our hand because we get sucked into this quickly. Listen, this is the definition of gossip. Destroying another's character. The word literally means to whisper. To gossip is to whisper. That thing you don't want them to hear. Come on. How many people have been caught doing that? This is how you know when you're wrong. When you're saying something and the person shows up. Right? Usually behind you and the person you're talking to is enjoying it because they know they're behind you, right? And you have that moment of, crap, busted. And then you try to rearrange your words and make it not sound as bad as what you really meant it to sound like. You know, you just happen to be talking about them and here they came, right? Gossip, can I tell you this? God hates gossip. Hates it. It's not a little thing. When you look at it, it's mixed in with the rest of these lists. Murder is in this list. Murder and gossip are in the same list. Hold your breath. Murder, gossip, homosexuality are on the same list. Okay, so before we decide to pick out certain sins, certain things, and point and go, yeah, those people, see, that's what happens when you don't follow God. We need to raise our hand. This is what happens when we don't follow God. Okay? Gossip, slanderers, God haters, insolent, arrogant, boastful. We got any arrogant, boastful people in here? Think it's all about them? They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey. That one really hit me. They invent ways of doing evil. You ever feel like that? You ever hear about something and you go, how do you even think to do that? That's crazy. Who thinks to do that? That is a sign of people who have decided they are going to be God. That is a sign of people who God has said, have at it. I'll leave you to the imagination of your hearts. You're going to come up with some craziness. Right? We invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they do not only continue to do these very things, but they also approve of those who practice them. Is that not our society that we live in now? I mean, all kinds of depravity. And what do? I've had a discussion several times with people. Is the world more wicked now than it used to be? No, it's just more open. It's more accepting. Right? These things have been in the human heart for forever. I mean, this was written 2,000 years ago, and this is what Paul says is going to happen when people stray away from God. Right? And we see it happening now. We're not ashamed anymore. Right? We're not convicted anymore. We don't call it out anymore. Instead, people applaud it and say, we're progressing, good job. We finally have the freedom to express that. We can express ourselves freely. I can finally be who I want to be. This is the result. I don't know how we argue with it. Again, other than to be insane, and I mean that, other than be insane or to close our eyes and not be aware of where the world is, I don't know how you deny it. This is a result of when we start to worship what is created rather than the Creator. When we start to go against the design of God, when we stop recognizing that He has formed us, He has set our purpose, we don't get to do that. This is where society goes. This is where we go as individuals. Okay? You start worshiping yourself and see how long these things take to creep into your life. Start to worship your material things. Watch greed just take over your life. Right? First thing we've got to understand this week before we get into next week, our roles as men and women, we have got to understand that God says what our purpose is. God says who we are. Right? A couple Thursday nights ago, Jason Tischer was here and son at the men's Bible study and brought this point up that one of the huge difficulties that we have is walking in who we are. Walking in our true identity. And I think that's because we don't allow God to define us. Instead, we try to define ourselves. And if we do that, we're always going to be living in opposition to our intended purpose. We have anybody use tools here? We got any people that are good with tools and stuff? What happens when you use a tool that it's not intended for? Doesn't damage usually happen? Listen, man, hammer and duct tape, that's all I need. That's all I need. I do some damage with those things because, I'll use anything as a hammer. If it's laying around, this something's kind of hard, I'm hitting stuff with it. It's just the way that I use stuff. Damage. When things are not used according to their purpose, damage happens. Okay? When we do not live according to our purpose, the purpose that God sets for us and has created us for, damage happens in our lives and the people around us. Okay, so we have got to allow God to be God and determine what we were created for. Okay, number one. All right, let's move on to the second one. This one will be significantly faster. Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 31. We're going to start to get an idea now. We're going to start to lay a groundwork of how we were created. All right, so we've kind of taken this big view. Right? Now we're going to zoom in a little bit closer. We know that God has created everything, that God has set a purpose for everything. He has the design. All right? He has the master plan. We talked about that. Now we're going to zoom in a little bit closer and start to look at what is this plan, specifically for us, for men and for women. All right? Genesis 1, 26 through 31. It says, "Then God said, let us make mankind in our own image." This is after He has already created everything else. "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in His own image. In the image of God He created them, male and female He created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with a seed in it. They will be yours for food, and to all the beasts of the earth and all the birds in the sky and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. God saw all that He had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning the sixth day. Okay, so now God has created everything else, and man comes on the scene. He creates man in His own image. What does that mean? There's a Latin phrase that has been around for thousands of years now, the Imago Dei. The Imago Dei, the image of God. We were created to bear the image of God. Okay? Nothing else bears that image. We are special in creation when it comes to that. Okay? We see this. God creates something, it is good. God creates something else, it is good. He gets to mankind, He creates them, man and woman, in His own image, and He says it is very good. Okay? We have a special place in creation. We carry the Imago Dei, the image of God. Okay? So what does that mean? A great way to understand this is in the ancient Near East, if there was a ruler who ruled over a distant land, He would put a statue in that distant land that served as an icon for people to look at, that would represent him and represent his ruling and his reigning in that land. Okay? God created us to be an icon, an image bearer in this world. Okay? That's what we were created for, to be an image bearer, to represent the glory of God. Okay? We serve as viceroys. A viceroy is one who rules on behalf of another. He puts us on this earth and he says, I want you to subdue all of the earth, have dominion over it. You are going to govern and run the earth on my behalf as my ambassadors, as icons of me. Okay? Can you hear that? The uniqueness that men and women hold in creation in the world? Okay, now let's talk about how this kind of plays out. Okay, so as image bearers, we have been given this elevated dignity above everything else, all of the rest of creation. Right? There's a dignity, there's a worth, there's an importance that isn't in anything else in creation. Right? So let's talk about that just for a second. So everything else in the earth, all of the animals, all of the plants, all of those other things, we are not equal with them. Okay, there are religions that will have us to believe that, oh man, we're all created equal, or we're all the same, we're all part of this universal earth and all these kinds of things. That's not the way we were created. We were given a special place, a unique place in creation. We are not on par with animals, right? And we know this to be true. Okay, so if you're an animal lover, I'm probably going to rattle you a little bit here. Let me say this. How about this before we even jump into it? As viceroys of God, as people who govern on behalf of God, we represent God in the way that we govern. All right, so when we see that word, that's a couple of different times says we are to have dominion over all of the earth, right? We have to make sure we see that in its proper context. We represent God in the way that we lead and we govern. So should we ever be cruel to animals? No, because when we do that, we mar the very image of God. Because is God cruel? No, God is loving and caring. We should be loving and caring for our animals, for pets. Right? We should be good stewards of the things that God has created. But we do not put them on par together. Right? Denny and Carrie Ann have 2 kids. Right? Olivia and Toby. How many dogs you guys have? 2. All right, so if all of a sudden they look and they go, man, you know what? Money has gotten so tight. I just don't know how we're going to make it. Something's got to go. They're not picking one of the kids. Right? Maybe some days. Right? They're not going to. Right? Matt Chandler, and I would encourage you, man, if you have several hours to invest in this, Pastor Matt Chandler from the Village Church in Texas did a series called A Beautiful Design, where he covers everything. I'm going to steal so much of his stuff. He did this whole series, a 10-week series on this. I would encourage you, you have time, it's like 10 hours long, so you have to commit to it. But man, he covers all this stuff, and he talks about that, right? He uses the same example with his family. We know there is something that just is inside of us that knows that all of those members of his family are not on equal footing, right? He's not going to go, well, let's see, who costs me the most money? I'll get rid of that one. Right? He doesn't do that. It's going to be between one of the dogs. They're the ones that are going to go. Okay? There's something in us that recognizes and distinguishes between us and the rest of creation. We see it as more valuable. Now, part of the twistedness, and I think we've experienced because we walked away from God and His plan and His design, and we've begun to make it up as we go along, and now we are God and we decide how things go. I think you can see that in the way that some of the groups that are out there, right? We can't cut down a tree because the tree has feelings and emotions or something. We can't cut down trees, right? And the way that we treat animals, we have crazy people that are dressing their animals. Right? That's insanity. They're not on the same level with us. We don't need to dress them. Can I get an amen? Move on? Okay. My wife said move on. Sinners. No. But we know that there's a special place that we have right? In God's creation, there is a dignity that comes with us that does not come with other created things. Okay? So that's one. It shows up in the way that we interact with other creations of God. All right, another one. This special dignity, this uniqueness that God has endowed us with, this image bearing that he has placed on us, gives us a different relationship with God, right? Because God has given us the ability to think, the ability to reason, the ability to feel deep emotions, all of these things gives us the ability to interact with God in a way that no other member of creation does, right? Your dog, as special as he is not praying. Okay, maybe yours is. But, right, animals do not have this relationship with God. We do. We've been given this unique position in all of creation to interact with God. Why? Because he has endowed us with these special attributes, his very own attributes, to be able to think and to reason and to feel. All of these things give us the ability to interact with God on a different level. Okay? And then finally, this is one I want to spend a couple more minutes than the other ones when it comes to. This uniqueness, this bearing the image of God, of having some of the very qualities of God, changes the way that we interact with one another. Or it should. Okay? We interact with each other differently than any other of God's creation. Right? There is an esteem, there is a dignity that should come with being a human being. There is a value in that we should see. That is not seen in any other area of creation. Okay? As I said earlier, the lion is not considering the zebra's feelings. Why? Because they weren't made in the image of God. We were. Now, deep breath. When we begin to devalue people and strip them of the imago Dei, the image of God in them, we begin to act like animals and treat others like animals. Okay? So when we begin to look at our society and we see all of these things that have gone wrong, that are struggling, I argue that these things are imago Dei issues. It is a failure to recognize the image of God, that each and every single person here carries the very image of God. And with that comes a dignity and a respect and a value that we should see each other with. Okay? So what's that look like in our world? Let's talk about some of the issues that are going on. All right, listen, how about abortion? Abortion is an imago Dei issue. It is a failure to recognize that baby carries the very image of God. Okay? When we try to make it something like, well, it's really not a baby, it's really not a person, we are marring the image of God. We are failing to give that baby, that human being, the dignity that comes with being a human being that is created in the image of God. Okay? That's an imago Dei issue. Do we understand it? Do we get that? Do we place human dignity on every single person? All right, how about this one? How about pornography? Pornography. That is an imago Dei issue. As a man, when I begin to look at that, what I am doing is I am treating a woman as an object to be used for my desires. I am stripping her of her imago Dei, the image of God. I'm stripping her of her value, of her worth, of her significance. Do we ever stop and think about the people that we see, these women that have, most of which have horrific stories and backgrounds that lead them to this, right? There aren't many women that grow up and say, you know what I want to do when I grow up? How many women are saying that? Right? There is tragedy in that. There is heartbreak in that. There is abuse in that drives these people to, and I'm using women because that's primarily what, in this industry, men are the consumers. Women are what is being consumed. Have you thought about them? The fact that they have been stripped of the imago Dei. That image of God has been marred in them that compels them to feel like they are less than human. That compels them to engage in these things that are degrading to them. Right? Only if we would only recognize that, I don't know how as men we would look at that and be okay with it. Now listen, some of this stuff's going to sting. If you're a person who has had an abortion, that's a reality, right? Listen, God forgives. Right? We're not condemning it. God forgives. We make mistakes. If you're a man that's come in here and has looked at pornography, or maybe you're looking at it right now, listen, God forgives. But can we recognize it for what it is so that and bring to them the very dignity and worth and value that they deserve? All right, here we go. Take another deep breath. Racism is an Imago Dei issue. Right? When you look at someone else and you make a judgment about them in a way that degrades them or sees them as less than you, you are failing to see the image of God in them. That is an Imago Dei issue. And listen, let me tell you, man, God has been hammering me with this week. Because, listen, we all have lenses that we see through, right? We all have beliefs. We all have opinions on all these different things. The question becomes, why do you have that opinion? Do you ever think about that? Why do you have the opinion that you have? Right? When you start to talk about black people are, okay, why? Where'd you get that opinion from? White people are. Poor people are. Where did you get that from? I felt like my opinions, my ideas were pretty solid. Right? I'm speaking the truth. Well, am I? Where does that come from? Listen, let me tell you something. If there's something, if you want to get me going, there's a couple of phrases you can throw out there. You throw out there white privilege. Right? You throw that phrase out there. Oh my goodness, you talk about setting me off. Slave mentality. People would say that and I would be like, oh my gosh, let me tell you why that's so stupid. Right? That's immediately where I went. This week God was going, okay, hold on, wait. Why do you have that idea? Why does that bother you? I went, I don't know. It's just right, I think. And he said, no, I want you to really stop and think about where do you get that? What is it about white privilege that bothers you? And see, I only looked at it from this perspective. Anybody, got any Saturday Night Live people here? No boldness at all. People are like, well, right? Own it. Right? There was a skit that maybe you remember, and you got to be of a certain age to remember this, that Eddie Murphy did. Right? Where he was checking out white privilege, right? Where he dresses up like a white guy, and the whole thing of the skit is he's going to go and find out how white people live and see what advantages they get. Right? And he's going in all these places. He goes in one store and he takes like a newspaper up there, right? And the guy's like, there's a white guy behind the counter. He's like, nobody's looking, go ahead and take it. Right? Nobody's looking, go ahead and take it. And Eddie Murphy's like, what do you mean? I haven't paid for the paper yet. And he's like, nobody's looking, go ahead. Right? So when people say white privilege, that's what comes into my mind. That's what comes into my mind, that people are giving me stuff. And I'm going, I've never been given anything. I've never been given anything. Don't bring that trash around here, white privilege. And then all of a sudden, God was going, okay, well, hold on, wait. I want you to stop and think about this. I was listening to a message by Matt Chandler, and he brought up a friend of his. He said, I have a pastor friend. He's a black pastor. Said, and he's married to a white woman. He said, and on 2 different occasions, he said, my friend has been pulled over by the police, and one police officer has asked him to step out of the car and has just asked him general questions. Hey, where are you going? What are you up to? That kind of stuff. While the other police officer goes around the side of the car and asks his white wife, is everything okay? Are you here on your own? Those kinds of questions, right? Now listen, last week, if I'd have heard that, I went, that's garbage. That doesn't happen. Come on, man. Listen, I was of the opinion that if you're a black man and gets pulled over by a police officer, if you're not doing anything wrong, then you just simply need to do what he says and move on, right? All of a sudden, I'm looking at that when I heard him tell that story, and I went, wait, that is an Imago Dei issue. That is a stripping of that man of his dignity as a man, right? That's what's happening there. And then it hit me. When I get pulled over by a police officer, it never crosses my mind that I'm going to be the victim of injustice. Never. It just doesn't. I don't ever think, hold on, is this guy going to pull me out of the car? Is he going to ask me questions? Am I going to be abused here? Am I going to be written a ticket because of my skin? It does not hit me. Guess what that is? That's white privilege. It just is. Right? But do we ever think about that stuff? Do we think about the effect that it has on a person when consistently they are treated as less than human? where their imago Dei is assaulted regularly, the impact that that has. Matt Chandler was talking about what happened in Ferguson when people were rioting and everything. He said, look, and I'm not condoning what anybody did. I'm not condoning sin. I'm not condoning destruction or any of that kind of stuff. He said, but listen, here's the point. You strip a person of their imago Dei, you treat them like an animal long enough, and guess what they will act like? An animal. And listen, that's what happens. We begin to act in a way that is not representative of the imago Dei, the image of God in us, because when it gets stripped down. These women, again, did not set out to say, this is what I want to do for my career. But when they've been stripped of their imago Dei long enough, guess what they will do? They will act like that. They will begin to do things that human beings shouldn't do. They shouldn't have to do. Right? This is an imago Dei issue. Do we understand who we are, and do we understand who other people are? Right? Do we see every single person we come in contact with as a bearer of the very image of God, of being given? And I don't care what they're doing. That's the thing. What they're doing does not change the imago Dei in them. Okay? Genesis 9:6 talks about that murder, when a man murders another man. Right? He's talking about people in the midst of sin, and he still says they are destroying the imago Dei. They're killing a man who has been made in the image of God. What we do on the outside does not change the fact that we have intrinsic value as human beings that God has given us. Right? We have got to understand who we are and walk in the fact that we are created as equals, men and women, black and white. All of these different things that separate us shouldn't. Right? All they do is reveal the glory of God. Right? That's what different races do. They reveal the beauty and the creativity and the glory of God. We have this sameness, this equality in the eyes of God, this value, this dignity. We all carry it. All right? So why is that so important from where we're going? Because we're going to hear some things and as we go through this series the next couple of weeks, where I'm going to say some things to you that you're going to be tempted to see as an imago Dei issue when they're not. Right? Regardless of your role, what God has given you to do, that does not change the dignity and the worth and the value that he has instilled in you. The tendency is going to be this. Oh, so you're telling me I'll just throw one out there to you. This is a big one. And you all are probably anticipating this. I'm going to talk about submission for women. Already, women getting jacked up. What are you going to say? Right? Getting all worked up. I'm not even going to tell you what that means at this point. This is all I'm going to say. If it's in God's word, right? Wives, submit to your husband. We can't take that out. That's what's in there. But whatever that means, and we're going to talk about it, whatever that means, it cannot mean that women are less than men. It can't mean that, because the imago Dei says we were created equally. We all have the same value. So no matter what roles God gives us, it does not speak to who we are as creations of God. It does not change that. Okay? So in the next 2 weeks, we've got to carry these two things with us. We've got to understand that God and God alone gets to determine purpose. Only Him. Only Him. If we decide to go against that, we are making ourselves God, and things are going to go poorly. Okay? So as we begin to talk about this, we're going to go from the Bible. We're not going to use my opinions, hopefully. I'm going to try to keep them out of them as much as I possibly can. Right? So we got to remember, this is God's design. So at the end of the day, if we are a believer, we say, oh, I believe that. In the beginning, God created. We have to be a believer in the design. You can't separate the two. You can't say, I believe God designed everything. He has a plan. He has an intent. All of that kind of stuff. And then say, well, I'm not going to live by it, though. It's one or the other. Either you believe it or you don't. Jesus said, who do men say that I am? Who do you say that I am? Why was Jesus asking that question? Because he wants to know, how do you see me? The way you see me should be reflected in the way that you live your life. Right? He's critical of that. Jesus is later going to say, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I tell you to do? To say, I believe that in the beginning God created, but I'm going to make up my own design. Those two things don't go together. Okay? So we've got to understand that this is God's design. You can argue with it if you want, but then don't say in the beginning God created. Okay? And two, all of us, every single person in here has been made in the image of God. We have worth, we have value, we have dignity. Why? Because we've earned it? No, because he gave it to us. It was a gift. Okay? Got to remember those two things as we begin to move forward and talk about what's a man look like in God's eyes? What does a woman look like in God's eyes? All right, let's pray. Father, I want to thank you for this message. I thank you for the fact that you speak truth. Your word is true. And Father, we may disagree with it. We may not like it. But at the end of the day, Father, this is your plan. You are the creator. You get to choose. So I pray that we can learn to submit to that as men and women, that we will be willing to look and say, Lord, we recognize that you are the creator God, and you alone get to decide who I am and what I've been created for. Father, may we try as best we can to allow you to search our hearts, search our minds, to discover why we think the way that we think, why we live in our lives the way that we are, that we would allow you to dig deep inside of us and find out why we have the opinions of manhood and womanhood that we do. And Father, as you begin to reveal those things into us, I pray that we can submit them to you, submit them to your word, that we can line up with what your word has said about us as men and women. May we walk in that. Father, so please give us this awareness of who we are in you, how we were created, and then give us this boldness and this strength to live that out, to go after it. Again, this series is not meant to just pass on information. If we have a little more information to go home with, or give us some more fodder to argue about, or Father, we just go home with another bullet in our holster that we can fire at our spouse as to why they're failing or whatever, then we're missing the point. I pray that we would be introspective, Lord, that we would allow you to search us, that we would look inside of us and see what's going on with us, that we can align ourselves or allow you to align us with your word and your design. So help us to do those things, Lord. Again, dig deep in our hearts and minds. Make us into the people, the men and the women you create us to be. So we love you and we thank you and pray these things, Lord, in Jesus' name. Amen.